that South Asia achieves these goals, because again next year we go into the HLPF with the concept of reducing inequality and focusing on inclusive growth. So these are some of the areas which all of us as nations, as individually, as nations and as a region need to focus on collaboratively, so that we are able to portray a better picture and the world is able to achieve the SDGs sooner than 2030. Thank you. I won't take.
Thank you, Sanyukta, for putting on the table in your concluding remarks some very interesting ideas and thoughts. And I, accept fully the importance of bringing private sector on the table. I mean, a lot of things will not be achieved without full participation of private sector. So this multi-stakeholder partnership that we are talking about should cover governments, civil society, private sector, and I think civil society broadly defined in any case includes private sector, but we should next time around bring private sector voices in the room, and that is a very good sort of thought that you have brought, and many others, which certainly we need to be taking on board for the future dialogues of this nature. Now let me turn to another partner, RIS, and Director General of RIS, my former colleague Sachin. You have the floor.
Thanks, Dr. Nagesh. Thanks, Sanyukta, for setting the stage, and I think your substantive comments have helped. I think when we are discussing in this session way forward, probably presence of all of you here itself is manifestation of the way forward that we would have of SDGs in the region. So a big hand to all of you for being here right from morning yesterday, as Niti Ayog's Vice Chairman pointed out, that the large number that was there in the conference room was itself indicative of what he never saw in case of MDGs. So how situation has changed from MDG to SDG, and I think his point that South Asia would have to play a much more important role in case of SDGs, probably at par with China, what China did in case of MDGs. So South Asia has a major responsibility. In terms of going forward, I just have 4 points, and I would be extremely brief with them. As a research institution, I see that there are a couple of researchable issues that have emerged in our 2 days deliberations, and as Dr. Nagesh reminded all of us, tomorrow in the day-long consultation that we have capped with think tanks, we would be picking them up again for detailed discussion, but suffice here to say that there are some researchable issues which have emerged in our discussions, and I think as Ratin very rightly pointed out, there are issues related to how we are going to raise resources for financing SDGs, and there are several strategies he talked about. We don't have time to get into details, but definitely it is important for us to see how this financing is going to be ensured. We are not going to be dependent, and fortunately South Asia's dependence on ODA, Official Development Assistance, has declined, and many of our partner countries have enhanced loan-based assistance, and that has gone up. To what extent we retain the sustenance of the financial system is important, and we need to find out in what direction we are going in. And I think Sanyukta again was absolutely right. The session that was there when TC Anand spoke about indicators, and within indicators, tier 3, he emphasized upon us to do more research, and more research in terms of what would be the applicability and relevance of indicators. And one very important point that he raised was that indicators are not solution for your targets. You have to see that some strategies are evolved where we go beyond indicators. So indicators would not be answering for all questions that we have, and that I think was extremely important. The point that Rashmi Agrawal raised in terms of impact assessment and its relevance for our work program is absolutely essential, and that's where civil society's ability comes in. And I think as Mr. Jha also raised, it is important that civil society also comes on the same page as others are, with their own perspective, of course. So it is not to harmonize views, but of course in terms of collating our energies for maximum output at the collective level. And from that perspective, I see it is important for us to get our acts together. And of course, the issues in terms of putting indicators and targets would largely be government responsibility, but to supplement that effort in terms of the data collection, not only by civil society, but as TCA rightly identified, role of the private sector providing data. So everything we need not leave on the government. All of us taking it forward collectively probably would be extremely important. Here again, Dr. Nagesh, I would like to draw your attention in the session that I chaired. It was time and again highlighted that when we have the government message in terms of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, brings in indicators and parameters where we bring in this message of no one should be left behind. So when we say no one should be left behind, it is largely the idea of Antodaya, and that concept should also get reflected in the indicators. So we need not go for too much divisive ideas of a society. And India being a very extremely pluralistic society, we would have to be extremely careful in terms of what UN agencies and other international agencies advance the agenda, and that I think requires tightrope walking, which we know in this polity we need to do. And from that point of view, the session where we had Professor Mustafizur Rahman's presentation was extremely important. The very idea of rights and justice and the balance between them, the idea of resource mobilization, and also between the voice and the participation. Sometimes we might not be hearing voice, we might not be seeing the participation, but we need to bring everyone on the table, and that's what the idea of Antodaya is going to bring in. So we need to devise strategies to move in that direction. But from the research point of view, I think the researchers who are working on issues related to SDGs would have to see that these narratives are back on the table. Though the right to development might have been discussed in 80s, but it still has the relevance. Because as you yourself in your work on FDI have been articulating the maneuvering space that developing countries and the governments require, I think we need to strike back that balance for that maneuvering space, not only for central government, but also for state government. And that's where the balance, I think, would be important. Annie's point in terms of avoiding exclusion in that session was extremely important. My second point is about strategy. And strategy, again, I pick up, Dr. Nagesh, from your point in the inaugural session about the youth bulge and we creating jobs. And that, I think, is important both in terms of our strategy for localization. And Sanyukta, that's your now responsibility. We are very keenly looking forward for what Vice Chairman said of putting up index together for states, ranking states, and in terms of their accomplishment on SDGs. So I think that's extremely important. And I very strongly appreciate the point that you raised about cross-border trade. I would just like to expand that a bit, and a couple of my colleagues at RIS are leading this work in terms of how we can develop cross-border development districts, where the responsibility that we are having on this side of the border, we do exactly on the other side of the border with development cooperation and development partnership. And that, I think, is absolutely important. I see Ram sitting here. He is pushing in for this idea of Bangladesh Tripura Connect, and that, I think, is absolutely essential for us to see that kind of symmetry where it is coming on, whether in Uttarakhand with Nepal or with Bangladesh with different border points. Can we have cross-border development districts as a viable proposition for us to move forward? India's own regional cooperation and commitment came up for discussion, and Debuda alluded to that idea of India's VNR not mentioning regional cooperation. And though I love you very much, Debuda, but I disagree on this front. My colleagues have given me this report, which is India's VNR, and they have very firmly placed index where all India has referred to regional cooperation. And at least I can count there are 4 or 5 places India has referred to regional cooperation. India has talked about the importance of India engaging in regional and global cooperation, and it starts with right from page 2 where they are talking about the idea of one world and bringing in again Prime Minister in terms of neighborhood first policy. So that is a major policy announcement that Prime Minister made right in 2014 and continuously, and with Bangladesh, his affection has been quite public in terms of several initiatives that have been launched. But on page 3, you would find a box item which is again in VNR that India presented to United Nations in 2017, talks about the Speakers Initiative, and where the South Asian speakers met and identified sustainable development goal as an agenda in terms of, it again came on the initiative of the speaker of Bangladesh, but Indian speaker also hosted, and then Sri Lankan speaker hosted the meet on SDGs. Again, if you go on page number 21, the idea comes up in terms of ensuring sustainability of fisheries and the Bay of Bengal initiative. It has detailed reference also to Sundarban cooperation for conservation of regional efforts for conservation of biodiversity. And you also find on page number 24 efforts for South-South cooperation in a regional context. So there are these initiatives, and even again in the way forward on page 27, the last paragraph, it again talks about importance of regional cooperation. So VNR does talk about India's commitment for that regional cooperation. Fortunately, RIS was very closely involved when Dr. Pangaria was vice chairman, and VNR was written out along with the team that worked in NITI on this. So I think regional commitment and regional vision is important. What probably we require now, and I agree with you, is in terms of delineating the facets of this. And as Sanyukta very rightly pointed out, trade, investment cooperation, and of course, as we discussed this morning, the idea of norm setting. They are important, and probably they would provide the way forward. And the meeting that you have convened at 5:30 today at RIS, I think is also absolutely important. Those of you who are interested are most welcome for 1.5 hour. Debopriya Bhattacharya has called a meeting today to discuss issues related to development cooperation and partnership that we can have in the region. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin, for highlighting a number of issues, and in particular, I fully recognize the speaker's initiative on SDGs. I remember addressing it myself. There was one in Dhaka where the Bangladesh speaker hosted all her counterparts from all the South Asian countries, a full-blown, very good meeting on SDGs, and I was actually invited to make a presentation on South Asia picture on SDGs, and I know that that process has carried forward. So I think we should link it up with other regional initiatives on SDGs, and also highlighting how India's VNR does refer to regional cooperation. Maybe they was looking at another version or another document and not this one, so maybe you want to share this version to Deb so that he stands corrected. Anyhow, that leads me to make some final remarks, and I think I don't want to really add to what had been said since yesterday morning, and some very erudite and very fruitful discussions have taken place, and all of that was such a heartening and interesting thing for me to sit through and listen to. And I was, as you know, mostly in the listening mode. And I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, this space that this meeting provided to South Asian governments, South Asian civil society actors and leaders to come together and talk and discover how much they have in common and how much they have a shared agenda and shared challenge. And so to respond to it collectively would be far more interesting and valuable. I think this is one message which has come out. And all we need to do is to continue this dialogue and find out what are the key mechanisms that we can use to harness the potential of regional cooperation for this collective journey towards 2030, towards sustainable development goals, towards poverty-free South Asia, towards hunger-free South Asia, and where every single one of South Asian people has, right to dignity, right to all the amenities of life, and then they can really contribute their latent potential to the development of the sub-region. So I think that is a message which is coming out, and coming from the SCAP perspective, I think providing a regional space, a regional platform is our main mandate. And in that context, this sub-regional forum is really exceeded my expectations of bringing all of you together and have this space for conversation. And in that context, I want to thank wholeheartedly our two partners, Niti Aayog and RIS, for joining us in this fascinating enterprise of bringing together the governments and civil society and other stakeholders for this discussion, which I thought was very, very fruitful, especially in the context of what we heard just in the previous